the 17th of March 1945. The skies over Germany were cold, thin, and unrelenting, stretching in endless layers of gray and white. For decades, pilots had fought to control the skies, and altitude had always been a silent advantage, a weapon in its own right. On this day, that advantage, once considered almost untouchable, was about to be shattered. The men of the Luftwaffe, Germany's proudest pilots, would wake to a new reality, one that challenged everything they had believed about aerial dominance. For years, the Luftwaffe had held the upper hand at high altitudes. Their aircraft, engineered with precision and fueled by experience, were feared across Europe. Above 25,000 feet, they were kings. Allied bombers and fighters had to fight their way up to reach them, often paying with blood and metal. Yet, as winter turned to spring in 1945, the war had entered a final, desperate phase. German cities were under relentless bombardment, the Reich's resources were stretched thin, and the skies above were no longer their domain by default. Enter the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, and surprisingly versatile, it was an American fighter that had quietly been changing the balance of air power. Initially, the Mustang had been designed to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, safeguarding the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds that raided German industrial centers. It was admired for its long range and formidable firepower, but its true gift, the thing that would make Luftwaffe pilots uneasy, was its engine. The Merlin V1650, licensed from Rolls-Royce, gave the P-51 a performance curve that was nothing short of revolutionary. At altitudes where air was thin and most planes struggled to breathe, the Mustang seemed to dance. Its engine roared with life where others faltered, pushing its wings higher, faster, stronger. German pilots, veterans of countless engagements, had become masters of altitude. They would climb above enemy formations, attack from the sun, and dictate the terms of every encounter. They knew their machines intimately. The Bf 109 seconds and FTU 190 seconds were nimble, responsive, deadly. At 30,000 feet, they were almost untouchable. And yet, intelligence reports had been trickling in for months. Sightings of P-51 seconds flying higher than anyone expected, engaging bombers without faltering, had become more frequent. On that chilly morning of March 17, reports came from radar stations and ground observers alike. Mustangs were climbing to altitudes that no fighter was supposed to reach. 35,000 feet. Higher. For the Luftwaffe, this was more than alarming, it was a paradigm shift. For decades, altitude had been a silent shield, an invisible line separating life and death in aerial combat. And now, it was gone. Inside the cockpits of German fighters, pilots were skeptical at first. Surely these were exaggerated claims. Mustangs could perform well, yes, but above 30,000 feet? That was the domain of bombers and reconnaissance planes, not nimble fighters. And yet, as reports poured in, the truth became undeniable. German pilots were seeing P-51 seconds at altitudes that were supposed to be untouchable, intercepting formations of their own Heinkel He 111 seconds and Junkers Ju 88 seconds, turning their calculations and assumptions upside down. The psychological impact was immediate. A pilot used to peering down on enemies from high above now faced an invisible predator that could appear seemingly from nowhere, strike with deadly precision, and vanish back into the clouds. The Mustang didn't just fly higher, it shifted the rules of engagement entirely. Luftwaffe aces who had relied on climbing advantage to execute dive attacks or to escape dogfights now found themselves vulnerable in a way they had never been before. It was an unfamiliar, terrifying sensation. To understand why this moment was so critical, we need to look at the strategic stakes. By March 1945, Allied bombing campaigns had already inflicted severe damage on German industry, transportation, and morale. Cities were smoldering, rail lines were shattered, and factories struggled to keep aircraft in the sky. German pilots were fighting a war they could not win in the air alone. Every interception of a bomber formation counted. Yet every missed chance, every failed climb, could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. In this environment, losing altitude superiority was not just a tactical inconvenience, it was a strategic disaster. And then there was the human factor. The Luftwaffe pilots who had survived nearly 5 years of war were skilled, hardened, and proud. They knew how to fight in impossible conditions, how to push their planes to limits that seemed insane to the uninitiated. But confidence, as it turns out, can be fragile. Witnessing an enemy achieve the impossible, the P-51 at 35,000 feet was like seeing the rules of the universe bend. It sowed doubt, and doubt in a fighter pilot is deadly. That morning, as the first reports confirmed the presence of Mustangs at these altitudes, commanders on the ground scrambled. Orders went out to intercept, to regroup, to find a solution. Yet, for every plane scrambled, there was a growing realization. The altitude game, the invisible advantage that had kept the Luftwaffe dominant for years, was slipping away. The Mustang was not just a plane, it was a revelation, a mechanical challenge that the Luftwaffe had no ready answer for. And so, the 17th of March 1945 became a day of quiet terror above the German heartland. Not in explosions or dramatic dogfights, but in the knowledge that the skies were no longer theirs. That high above, where only veterans had once dared to climb, an enemy could now appear at will. That the rules they had trusted for years about climb rates, ceiling heights, and tactical superiority were suddenly rewritten. For the first time, the fear in the Luftwaffe was not about numbers or firepower. It was about impossibility made real. By mid-morning, the reports were undeniable. P-51 seconds were appearing over key targets, engaging German fighters in ways that were both precise and ruthless. The Mustang pilots, often flying at altitudes where oxygen was thin and cold, made fingers numb, seemed unfazed. They climbed, they descended, they escorted bombers, and they returned with minimal losses. And as each engagement ended, German pilots faced a grim realization. The top of the sky, the realm they had once ruled, was now contested. And contested it was, and in ways they could not counter. This was the beginning of the end for Luftwaffe dominance in the air. It wasn't a spectacular battle with thousands of aircraft clashing in midair, though there would be those. It was a subtle, almost invisible shift, one that would be remembered in diaries, in mission logs, and in the fearful whispers of pilots climbing through the thin morning clouds. A shift that signaled that the war in the sky was changing in ways that were unstoppable. Even as the sun rose higher, illuminating shattered towns and distant mountains, the pilots below and above understood a chilling truth. The Mustang, and the men flying them, had reached a place that no German fighter was meant to go. They had taken the sky, and in doing so, they had taken more than territory. They had taken certainty, confidence, and the intangible advantage of altitude itself. That day, as German pilots stared into their oxygen masks and scanned the endless blue above, the thought ran through their minds like a cold wind. No matter how fast we climb, no matter how skilled we are, the P-51 seconds can always be higher, and in that knowledge, the skies had already begun to slip away. By late morning on the 17th of March 1945, the sky over Germany had become a theater of tension, though it appeared calm from the ground. To a casual observer, it might have looked like nothing more than thin clouds drifting across a pale blue sky. But high above, every inch of that airspace was a battlefield of nerves, skill, and split-second decisions. German pilots, seasoned veterans of countless engagements, were now confronting a challenge they had never anticipated. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just fast or powerful, it was something new, something that defied expectation and upended the rules of combat at altitude. Reports from Luftwaffe reconnaissance had been streaming in for weeks, but today the intelligence became undeniable. Mustangs were climbing above 35,000 feet, and unlike earlier sightings, they weren't retreating at the first hint of German fighters. They maintained formation, they executed precise maneuvers, and they escorted bombers with a confidence that seemed almost unnatural in the thin, freezing air. At these heights, the temperature could drop to nearly minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and oxygen was scarce. Pilots in BF 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds struggled with frost forming on their windshields and fingers numbing inside gloves. Yet the Mustang pilots operated as if the altitude posed no obstacle at all. It wasn't luck. The secret lay in a combination of aerodynamics, engineering, and clever application of technology. The P-51's Merlin engine, a British design adapted for American use, had a supercharger system that allowed it to perform efficiently at altitudes where other fighters would lose power. German pilots, relying on older engines optimized for mid-altitude engagements, suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage they hadn't prepared for. And it wasn't just about climbing higher, it was about sustaining combat efficiency once there. The Mustang could maintain speed, maneuverability, and firepower even at the top of its operational ceiling. On the German side, pilots scrambled to intercept. Mission logs from Jagdgeschwader units recount frantic climbs, oxygen-starved crews, and desperate attempts to gauge the capabilities of these elusive Mustangs. At first, some pilots attempted the usual tactics: high-speed dives, sun attacks, and head-on passes. But time and again, the Mustangs seemed to anticipate their moves. They held formation, covered bombers, and even engaged the German fighters aggressively when needed. For Luftwaffe pilots, the surprise was compounded by the Mustang's range. Unlike earlier Allied fighters, which could only operate near the front lines, the P-51 could escort bombers deep into Germany and back, maintaining their altitude advantage the entire way. One German pilot later described the experience with a mixture of awe and fear. It was as if the sky itself had turned against us. We were climbing into a place we had always thought safe, and there they were, Mustangs, at altitudes that should have been impossible. We could not outclimb them. We could not shake them. And the bomber formations we were meant to protect, they were no longer ours to dictate. The impact of these engagements went beyond immediate losses. German pilots were forced to rethink how they approached every mission. Altitude, once a source of tactical dominance, became a liability. Climbing too high could mean meeting a Mustang unexpectedly. Staying lower exposed bombers and ground targets to attack. Every decision carried new layers of risk. For commanders plotting sorties, this shift required rapid adaptation, but resources were dwindling and replacements for experienced pilots were scarce. The Luftwaffe was fighting not just machines, but a changing set of rules that they could not master overnight. Meanwhile, the Mustang pilots, many of them young and relatively inexperienced, were executing complex missions with remarkable precision. They had trained extensively on tactics that leveraged their plane's strengths: climb rates, high-altitude maneuverability, long-range escort missions. But in the air, it wasn't just about following procedures, it was about split-second thinking, awareness of position, and the ability to react to unexpected threats. They were often flying above 35,000 feet, battling the cold, fatigue, and thinning oxygen, while making decisions that would determine the survival of entire bomber formations. Allied bomber crews soon realized the benefit. Before the arrival of the Mustangs, daylight bombing missions had been perilous. Heavy losses occurred because fighters could only reach the bombers halfway, leaving them vulnerable over enemy territory. Now, with Mustangs escorting them all the way to and from targets, bombers could operate with unprecedented protection. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. They were no longer facing isolated fighters. They were facing a constant, unseen presence at altitudes that had once been their own domain. Adding to the drama were the individual engagements that would later become legendary. One Mustang pilot reported spotting a Fu-190 diving toward a formation of B-17 seconds. The German pilot likely assumed he had the advantage from above. But the Mustang, climbing from a higher altitude than anyone expected, intercepted at a speed and angle that left the Luftwaffe pilot little time to react. In the blink of an eye, the attacker was forced to disengage, frustrated and confused. Moments like these repeated across Germany's skies that day, a series of small but decisive confrontations that cumulatively shifted the momentum of the air war. Ground observers and radar stations also recorded an anomaly. Normally, high-altitude flights would show a predictable pattern, with bombers and escorts climbing in well-defined formations. On March 17, there were deviations: Mustangs appearing at altitudes where no Allied fighter had been seen before, maneuvering around radar detection points, and altering attack vectors with astonishing speed. Analysts at the time recognized that these small variations were symptomatic of a much larger change. The Luftwaffe no longer held uncontested control over high-altitude airspace. Even for seasoned observers, the technical aspect was mesmerizing. Engineers and pilots noted the P-51's laminar flow wing design, which reduced drag and allowed for sustained high-speed climbs. Paired with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it became a platform that could dominate both mid- and high-altitude airspace. It wasn't just the engine or the wings, it was the combination of reliability, fuel capacity, and pilot skill that created an almost untouchable aerial package. The Germans, for all their experience and ingenuity, simply had no direct answer at that moment. By late afternoon, the psychological toll on Luftwaffe pilots was visible. Mission reports hinted at hesitation, misjudged maneuvers, and a rising level of caution. The realization that altitude advantage had been lost was slowly sinking in. It was no longer about brute skill alone. It was about adapting to a fundamentally new enemy capability. And adaptation was not instantaneous. Each engagement, each climb and dive served as a stark reminder. The P-51 seconds were here to stay, and their performance was rewriting the rules of the air war. The 17th of March 1945 would be remembered in pilot logs, diaries, and after-action reports as a turning point. Not because of massive dogfights or staggering losses, but because of a subtle, invisible shift, one that could change the outcome of missions, the confidence of pilots, and ultimately the air war over Germany. The sky, once a realm of controlled dominance for the Luftwaffe, had become a contested space where previous advantages no longer guaranteed survival. As the day drew to a close, the reports trickled back from every squadron, confirming what had been feared. Mustangs had been seen at altitudes no German fighter could match consistently, and bomber formations had returned largely unscathed. It was a quiet victory for the Allies, but a jarring realization for Germany's airmen. Altitude, the silent arbiter of air superiority, was no longer theirs. And that shift, invisible to most, would echo throughout the final months of the war, changing strategies, tactics, and the very way battles in the sky were fought. As the 17th of March, 1945, moved into late afternoon, the skies over Germany had transformed into a theater of quiet tension and high-stakes calculation. For the Luftwaffe pilots, what had started as disbelief in the morning had evolved into grim recognition. The P-51 Mustang was no ordinary threat, it was a revelation. Every maneuver, every climb, every sighting above 35,000 feet chipped away at the confidence and tactics that had sustained German air power for years. By this point, engagements were becoming more frequent, more precise, and more unsettling. German aces, those seasoned masters of dogfight and altitude, now faced an enemy that could appear above them, below them, or seemingly out of nowhere. Traditional strategies of diving attacks, sun position ambushes, and altitude advantage were failing, forcing pilots into reactive, improvised tactics. Each interception became a gamble, a contest of nerves, reflexes, and luck, rather than experience or superior positioning. One striking encounter exemplifies the changing nature of air combat that day. A flight of FW-190 scrambled to intercept a formation of B-17 spotted a group of Mustangs climbing from above. The German pilots attempted a coordinated dive to catch the bombers before the Mustangs could intervene. Yet, within moments, the Mustangs executed a series of maneuvers that nullified the attack. Diving, climbing, and rolling with precision, the Mustangs shielded the bombers and even forced one W-190 into a near-vertical escape to avoid collision. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, yet the psychological impact lingered far longer. German pilots, who had faced countless threats over the years, now realized the true scale of their disadvantage. It wasn't just skill that made the P-51 so lethal at high altitude, it was engineering married to strategy. Its laminar flow wings minimized drag, allowing climbs to altitudes once considered unreachable for a fighter. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine maintained power where other engines faltered, giving it speed and maneuverability that could dominate engagements even at the upper limits of operational ceilings. And unlike many earlier Allied aircraft, the Mustang's fuel capacity allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, ensuring that it could exert influence across the most critical points of the air war. For Luftwaffe commanders, this day forced a bitter reassessment. Mission logs indicate that units were scrambling, not with confidence, but with a growing sense of vulnerability. Pilots were instructed to climb faster, engage earlier, or avoid confrontation altogether in certain sectors. Yet, even with tactical adjustments, the reality was clear. Altitude, the invisible, almost sacred advantage that had long protected Germany's airspace was lost. And once lost, it could not be regained without substantial technological change or a miracle in the form of reinforcements and new aircraft, neither of which were available in the spring of 1945. The psychological toll on the German airmen cannot be overstated. Veteran pilots, many of whom had survived years of war, were facing a humbling, unprecedented challenge. Letters and diaries from this period describe the sensation as the sky itself turned against us, a feeling of fighting in a space where the rules had suddenly changed. There was fear, certainly, but also resignation. They knew that each climb to intercept the Mustangs carried new risks. Each engagement could end with a narrow escape or worse, loss of aircraft and life. And the realization that their opponents, often younger and less experienced, could exploit both technology and altitude to devastating effect was a bitter pill to swallow. By evening, reports confirmed that bomber formations had returned to base largely intact. The Mustangs had successfully protected them, flying at altitudes German fighters could not consistently challenge. The day's operations were meticulously logged. Each sortie, each engagement, each encounter analyzed and dissected. Analysts noted a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The Mustang had effectively rewritten the rules of high-altitude aerial warfare. German pilots could no longer assume dominance at the top of the sky. Their strategies, honed through years of experience, had to be re-evaluated in real time under life and death pressure. The larger strategic implications were profound. Allied bombing campaigns could now operate with far greater security, striking deeper into the Reich with fewer losses. German industrial output, already stretched thin, faced increasingly relentless attacks. And above it all, the psychological weight of losing altitude dominance affected not just the pilots in the air, but the commanders planning every sortie. Every decision, every order, now carried the silent acknowledgement that the skies were no longer theirs. For the Mustang pilots, the day was one of measured triumph. Their planes, their training, and their courage had converged to challenge a foe long considered untouchable. Flying at extreme altitudes, often battling freezing temperatures and the thin, choking air, they had demonstrated the remarkable effectiveness of their aircraft and tactics. Each bomber returned safely, each engagement completed, added to the growing legend of the Mustang's dominance in high-altitude combat. As night fell over Germany, the skies emptied, leaving only traces of contrails stretching toward the horizon. The Luftwaffe pilots returned to base with a profound sense of uncertainty. The day had not ended in massive explosions or dramatic crashes, but it had ended in a quiet, irrevocable shift. The P-51 Mustang had claimed the upper sky, and with it, it had claimed a strategic advantage that would echo through the final months of the war. In retrospect, the 17th of March, 1945, stands as more than a date on a calendar. It is a testament to the power of technology, training, and courage to redefine the battlefield. It is a story of skilled pilots confronting the impossible, of engineers crafting machines that could change the rules, and of a war where the invisible battle for altitude decided the fate of men, machines, and missions. For the Luftwaffe, it was a day of quiet defeat, a day when the air they had dominated for years became contested, unpredictable, and dangerous. For the Allies, it was a demonstration of the P-51's unmatched capabilities, a harbinger of the relentless pressure that would continue to bear down on the Reich. And for history, it remains a moment when the skies themselves told a story. The age of German altitude supremacy was over, and a new era of air dominance had arrived. High above the clouds, where the rules had been rewritten forever. As the final light of day faded and the first stars appeared over shattered towns and battle-worn landscapes, the pilots of both sides knew something profound had changed. The P-51 seconds would continue to climb, continue to escort, and continue to challenge every assumption about what was possible in the sky. And every German pilot who had glimpsed them at 35,000 feet understood a truth that could not be ignored. The war for the skies was entering its final, most unforgiving phase, and altitude would no longer save them.